He was president of the Journalists' Union, a political journalist and foreign correspondent for NPR. He has been published in the world's leading media, including the New York Times, Financial Times, Washington Post, and Observer. He was in charge of the SABC's radio coverage of the 1994 election and afterwards became a councillor of the Independent Broadcasting Authority. His latest book is God, Spies and Lies. My sincere thanks to both of you for agreeing to open this very necessary public discussion. John's going first.
Can you all hear? Well, thanks very much, Fanula. I see quite a lot of you here that I know and recognize, and it's glad to see you all. I'm going to talk first, and when I'm done, Pippa will. Pippa has been more recently on the board of the SABC, and she's got some great updates and figures, and she also knows Hlaudi Motsoeneng better than I do, and she'll be able to give you some insights into him. We're meeting at a very interesting time because as we speak, I just drove in and listened to the radio, the ad hoc committee of Parliament investigating the SABC's corruption and other misdeeds is wrapping up its report, and at the same time the communications committee in Parliament is getting onto the business of establishing a new interim board and then a permanent board after that. So everything is in flux, and I have to say I've followed this process pretty closely since prior to '94, and the last time I can remember Parliament doing its job, including everyone in the governing party, with real integrity, really was in 1996, which I think is the only other case that I can think of in this kind of context. When I was the whistleblower for the corruption in the Independent Broadcasting Authority, went down to Parliament. We sat in the old white Parliament, by the way, which was the Parliament I'd been barred from my entire career, but I was allowed in for that, and exposed the corruption of people in the first really big public case of corruption, which happened also to involve broadcasting. And I'm happy to say that the corrupt people were thankfully multiracial, as were the honest people, which was extremely helpful to me at the time as a whistleblower. And what's happened now, I think you shouldn't underestimate. This ad hoc committee that was meeting in December, as far as I could see, every member of whatever party really handled themselves with integrity and really fought to clean things up. Now, part of it, of course, is because they're worried about the losses in the August elections. And the other, what it really tells you is not that the battle against corruption has been won, but that at least it's been joined. The ANC now really is divided. You've got the faction that are trying to clean it up, but Zuma hasn't lost authority, and so that battle's still going on, and it will get harder when they come to choosing the new board. Anyway, with that background, I wanted to take a step back because what's interesting and what partly motivated this book was that South Africa's media and politics have always had this particular kind of interaction. I've always been interested in how the continuities as well as the discontinuities you have when you have a revolutionary change like we had in 1994. In fact, I was thinking about this question of decolonization in this context. You still have it today. The battle between private broadcasting and public broadcasting, between state propaganda versus independent public broadcasting, and the whole funding issue. Now, so with that headline, I'm going to take you back and just put this all in a bit of context. The interesting thing to me is the first media in South Africa, as some of you will know if you've read my book, was in 1800 by the British. The Dutch didn't seem to care about media, and that's probably because the colony was run by a company, the Dutch East India Company, rather than a government. So when the British came in, they quite quickly established the first newspaper, corruptly. The first newspaper was started by a corrupt British governor, Sir George Young, who awarded the license to a major slave trading company with offices in Plain Street, Cape Town, and he got kickbacks. The governor got kickbacks. And the relationship was so overt that they proudly named one of their proudest ships, slave trading ships, the Lady Yonga, in honor of the governor's wife. It is true that the British did send out an investigation team inquiry who got rid of the governor. But that's our start. But so we were behind. We were behind India. We were behind Canada in starting the first newspapers. I think even Australia and several other territories that you might have considered roughly equivalent. By 1998, and I must tell you, also writing this book, I started going to the history department, South African History Association meetings and so on. I find that politics is still, history is still so contentious. There are people who won't hear a good word about Jan Smuts, and I'm sort of neutral on that. I don't have a particular fan type feeling for Smuts. But the interesting thing is, you have to recognize that when the British came in, they did advance the governance of the place. And so when radio came to South Africa, came in about 1898, there were already experiments by Scots and Brits and Englishmen in Cape Town and Port Elizabeth. They then started listening to the sound waves coming from the ships that came into port. In 1924, with the first proper radio stations in South Africa. They were all started rather eclectically. There were battles over whether they'd be commercial or non-commercial. They were started differently in Cape Town, Durban, and Joburg. In Joburg, they didn't want to have that radical Kentridge, grandfather of the artist, who was a Labour member of the Joburg City Council, and they thought he was dangerously radical, and they didn't want the City Council to have control of the radio station. So they put it into the hands of the Science Association. In Cape Town, it was put into the hands of the Tourism Board, and that was done in, very opposite to our notions of independent regulation. So David Graaf owned the license. He was also the Minister of Posts and Telegraphs. And he'd also bought the equipment. And so the Tourism Board came to see him, and he said, let's get into the car. They did have cars. And they went down to see the Postmaster General. And so David Graaf said, Postmaster General, do I own the license to the radio station in Cape Town? He said, yes, you do. He said, well, would you please give it to these people? And he said, yes, sure. And in Durban, it was run by the Durban Council. Anyway, they went broke within 3 years, all three of them. And this is a quote I haven't used in public before, so I thought I'd use it here. They were running. There was no news on the radio at that time, and there was no advertising. It was all done on license fees. And one of the papers said, the public were listening without paying, like gutter snipes endeavouring to watch a circus from under the tent wall. And the worst gutter snipes were in Johannesburg. You in Cape Town were slightly less gutter snipe prone. Anyway, so in 27 they'd all gone under, and then a New York Jewish tycoon by the name of Schlesinger took them over. And he travelled between here and New York. He was based here, and he was in mining and media and all sorts of things. And he decided to build it up along the American model of commercializing it, still with no news, because he thought that was too controversial. And so he built it, he added transmitters all around the country. 1934, General Herzog, who'd somewhat become anglicized because he believed once we'd got independence from self-governance from Britain, his quarrel with Britain was in past, and he brought in Lord Reith, who was the famous man who who started BBC and became famous. Reithian is still a term for great public-minded broadcasting. And he was quite an interesting, rather eccentric Scottish Calvinist, but who did believe in bringing facts into relation, which was a complicated way of saying bringing news, a controversy, untampered with by either the government or commercial enterprises. And so that was really the start of public broadcasting, and everything was public broadcasting from then on. During World War II, I'm going to go through this very rapidly, but during World War II, I don't see Tony Hurd or Janet Hurd here, but Tony Hurd's father, George Hurd, who later died mysteriously, apparently at the hands of the Josef Brandbach, was a journalist who exposed Nazi sympathizers inside the SABC. So this was very controversial in the SABC during the war. The National Party took over in 48, but it was not till 59 that they put the Broederbond in charge under Piet Meyer, who was also the chairman of the Broederbond, and who built the Broederbond offices conveniently nearby the SABC so he could shuttle between offices, and really took control of the SABC, and he was extremely ruthless. Somebody came on from the Black Sash and he said, well, good luck with your protest. That was the end of his career. He was never allowed on radio again. Robert Kennedy came to South Africa. You wouldn't have known it from the SABC. One of the most famous people in the world. So that's how things were. Then in the 80s, you had Christopher Lyon, who was also a Broederbond chairman of the SABC, engineer from Stellenbosch. And when they started panicking about the end of apartheid, there was a move to rapidly commercialize and even privatize bits of the SABC. But there was strong resistance. Some of us were even part of it, and that didn't happen. I came back, I was in Chicago to chair something called Free, Fair and Open, which was a conference in 1992 here with all the political parties, government and broadcasters to set the terms for future broadcasting. And I noticed during these ad hoc committee hearings that people talked about a golden age of SABC. And they seemed to be thinking mainly of the 94 to 99 period, when it was really run by Zwelakhe Sisulu, who I'd known from the Rand Daily Mail. We'd become friends, and we joined the SABC the same day. Now, the interesting thing about that is, and this is sort of sets up for the later discussion, Zwelakhe had come out of the Rand Daily Mail. He then, for a time, became Mandela's spokesman, traveled with him to New York, and I traveled with them. And I remember Zwelakhe was really struggling with how to deal with Mandela. You know, there was such a sensitivity and protectiveness around Mandela. And I would say he never really was totally willing to let him be freely interviewed. Although, you know, I trained Mandela for television the next year, and I can tell you he outstripped all of us as a media buff. Ignored a lot of my advice, including not to wear very colourful shirts. But the interesting thing is, Mbeki was already taking power by the mid-90s, although he was deputy president, as you know. And Mbeki would go and see Zwelakhe Sisulu on the top floors of the SABC and try to harangue him into being more pro-ANC on the air. And it was very interesting. Zwelakhe could and did resist him. But of course, these were two of the four most famous families, ANC families in the country. And so Zwelakhe had the testicles to stand up to him and the political authority to do so. But the pressure was already on, and I saw it very vividly, because when we had the hearing on corruption in broadcasting, which I was mentioned to you earlier, 96 I think it was, this was the Public Accounts Committee hearing, and I think it's really echoed for the first time in the hearings we've had the last few weeks. There were ANC people who spoke out aggressively against corruption, no matter whether it was ANC people or not. And who were they? Andrew Feinstein, who was out of office within 3 or 4 years. Barbara Hogan, who lasted a little longer. And Lalu Chiba, who's a terrific ex-Robben Island guy, but he's really a backroom guy and stayed in the backroom. But so that really didn't continue. And what the ANC did to try and disguise the corruption was to demand that everybody, honest and crook, resign, so that you could fudge it. And in fact, what happened in the long term was all the crooks got posted higher and higher, I have to say multiracially, and all the honest people's careers were finished. So we're really now at that sort of tipping point where maybe things can change. And I just say the last thing, am I sort of out of time? The last thing I'll say is we're greatly advanced. What happened in CODESA was there was a discussion about whether the SABC itself would be made a Chapter 9 body so that it would be constitutionally protected. But the end result was to make the Independent Broadcasting Authority, now ICASA. The IBA was the body that I was on, the first one, and was to make that the Chapter 9 body, so it was independent of political interference and responsible to Parliament, not to the executive, to the legislature, not the executive. But I already saw that breaking down from very, very early on, because you could be, the ministry started to be more and more controlling, and what they did, the real way, the way you undermine the Constitution, I can give you the secret because it's, all the bad guys have figured it out already, is you have a revolving door between positions like the IBA, the SABC, and the Department of Communications in government. Well, once you've been out of office and suddenly you've got no money, and you get a job in the Department of Communications, if they've protected you, and they then use their influence to roll you back into one of these positions, you really have lost your independence. And that's really what happened. And so I would say there's one still flaw, and I'll end on this now, is that although you have this ad hoc committee doing its job as you would want it to do, and that is because it's getting protection from one faction in the ANC, primarily from the Chief Whip, Jackson Mthembu. They're being protected to do an honest job. But in the end, when they choose new board members, you have these hearings, and believe me, I've been to most of them, and you have this interaction. And I can tell you what happened last time. When they appointed Ellen Shabalala, who turned out not to have the degree she claimed, had to leave as chair of the SABC, that whole group, the hearings were quite decent, better than usual. And then there would be the closed meeting in the parliamentary committee at which they said, okay, which of these guys do we put on? And they made their list. And then they came back the next week and they had a similar list. And then they came back the third time and they had a list from Hlaudi House. And it was a different list, and they were told to be unequivocal, and they were. And so you still have the problem that there's an ANC committee, and I suppose this is part of the list system and so on. There's an ANC committee which sits in Hlaudi House. And of course, Zuma can instruct them to a considerable degree. But they sit there and they're making decisions and you don't know them. And some of them are people in the revolving door, by the way. And so that to me is still a flaw, and it's still contradiction with what the Constitution and the Broadcasting Act say, which is that the board must be chosen based on a certain set of skills in public hearings of the Parliament. So that's still where we are. I am hopeful because the ANC has panicked enough about last year's elections. It took a little while for the panic to shed in because they were so confident before the August elections that, as you'll know, they forgot to shred. So the mayor of Pretoria walked in, the new mayor, DA mayor of Pretoria walked in to the mayor's office, and he found a whole pile of investigative reports completed and untouched into the corruption of his predecessors. It had never been used. They were virgin reports. And so he could take them and say, this one's for the police, this one's for the prosecutors, this one's for the public protector. And so hopefully something will come of that, although you're never totally sure. So they were so gobsmacked at the losses, but now they're starting to realize it, and they are realizing they have to improve, and if they don't get some things right, they could lose the government in 2019. So that's a sobering thought, and one always says that you're not a true democracy until there's a real threat of the governing party losing power, and that's, I guess, where we are teetering on the edge of being now. And so there is some hope. And I think if they don't appoint a decent board and get things under control, I think they are worried. I mean, I think there are disputes going on in this ad hoc committee between opposition MPs and the ANC over how seriously to censure the minister and things like that, which you can, as you would expect. But I think they do also realize that if they don't do this properly, the public is aroused, and the public won't forget. I'll stop there and hand over to Pippa. Oh, I'll give you.
And give him some.
Sorry, yeah.
Shall we just leave that? You're going to have it. Can I clip it to your collar? Do you want to test that? Is it not through your mouth now?
It's fine. It's fine, yeah, thank you. I think might need my glasses. Which are right here. Thanks, John. I think John gave you a really excellent overview and background. And I have a few slides just to show you some numbers. I must wait. Okay. Okay, well, it'll come, but it warms up, so let me...
Yes, it's flickering.
It's flickering. There we go. Let me start. But before I do that, could I just say two quick things which have nothing to do with my talk? But one is, this is an experiment in journalism, a different type of journalism that we did last year here with the Poverty and Inequality Initiative and the Media Studies students, who produced a newspaper on poverty and inequality issues around Cape Town. So I've brought some for you. If you'd like to take one, then please do. And just have a look at the kind of the stories they're doing. And secondly, just to say that I saw my erstwhile colleague, I think, Charles, walk in. So it's very nice to see you here. He was probably one of the better known, I was on radio, never on TV, but he was one of the better known television journalists who I'm sure many of you will remember. So nice to see you here. I think that John has given a really good synopsis of why we're concerned about the broadcaster, the stories that have come out about the greed, the poor governance, the lack of rules. And the thing that concerns me is that it's gone on for so long in various forms. It's been like a long-running soap opera, sometimes with bizarre twists, but it's really run over several years. And yet, what I want to talk about a bit is radio, to just show that it's actually one of the most important public institutions in the country. Many of the politicians, and I think many of those who live in the cities and who are better off, just ignore radio because people watch television or they've got access to other kinds of media. But it's probably the most important thing that the SABC does, and this is precisely why it's so critical as a public broadcaster. So I've just put some numbers up here to show you that there are about 33 million people overall in South Africa who listen to radio. About 28 million of those, at least by figures, rely on radio principally for their source of news. That's how important it is. And community radio, as you can see from here, is pretty small. Now, let me see if I can figure out there we go, how we go down here. There we go. So there are about 227 radio stations in South Africa, including the commercial and the community stations. And this, before I actually, although you might have glimpsed, show you, I would like to just get a sense of what people listen to here. But what would you say? Anybody guess? What is the most listened to, the biggest station in the country? Sorry? Cape Talk, okay. Yeah? Anyone else?
English and Afrikaans.
702, English and Afrikaans. Okay. Let's just have a look. Here are the top 10 radio stations in the country. Okay, that's Ukhozi FM, the Zulu radio station, 7.5 million. Next one is Metro, then Mhlobo, the station based in Port Elizabeth, 4.6 million. These are the latest figures I've got off Rams, and I'll show you how to get there. Lesedi is the Sesotho-speaking station in Bloemfontein. Motsoeneng is the Setswana-speaking station in Mafikeng. Then Thobela, which is the Sepedi-speaking station in Polokwane. Jacaranda Kaya 5 FM RSG, there it is, it's number 10. It's pretty good out of 227 stations, 1.7 million. Of those, how many are SABC stations? Does anyone know?
2, 3.
3 are SABC stations. Let me tell you how many are. 8. 8 of the top 10 are SABC stations. So that's how critical the public broadcast is. I know that you spoke about, I heard some names of stations I thought that people in Cape Town might listen to, so I pulled out some of those figures. This is how you find the figures. I don't expect anyone to read this, but this is from a thing called RAMS, which is the Radio Audience Measurement Survey, which just lists them, and it shows over several years, and it shows over the last 3 years or 4 years, and it shows you how much they've gone up or down. So because nobody can read it, including myself, I just pulled out, these are the SABC stations, all of them. And I'll go back to that now, but I just want to show you what those ones were. So remember what the Ukhozi figure was, 7.5 million. RSG, the 10th on that list, Radio Sonder Grense, the Afrikaans public broadcast station, was 1.7 million. 702 of the commercial stations is 979,000, less than a million. Cape Talk is about 86,000. It's small. It's got I work there part-time, by the way. I work in their newsroom doing news editing. It hasn't got an FM transmitter, so it's quite disadvantaged, as lively as it is. SAFM, which is the SABC station, English language station, which has a national transmitter, and the advantage of being a kind of, what is considered a common language across the country, has really, and although I think its current affairs shows are still pretty good, by the way, it's gone down quite considerably to less than 500,000. So it's less than a third of the size of the Afrikaans-speaking station, RSG, which is because Afrikaans is probably more of a common language, a second language to people than English. We often don't realize that living in the communities that we live in. And these are, this is just a little graphic of the SABC, the public broadcast and commercial stations that they have, because they have 5FM, Good Hope, and what's the other one, the commercial station? John, what? No.
KFM.
No, KFM is a Prime Media one. Sorry. It's Metro, the commercial stations. So the commercial stations are 5FM, their radio, Good Hope, and Metro FM. So, and the idea was, and John will have been involved in these early negotiations, the idea was that the commercial stations would cross-subsidize the public broadcast stations. In reality, certainly when I was there last, it doesn't work that way. That the public broadcast stations have so many listeners that that's where the advertisers want to be, and they actually are, more or less self-sustaining, although they don't do that well. So this is just to show you the critical place that radio has in South Africa and the absolutely critical role that the SABC plays in radio. It holds an important place in all of Africa, I think, probably because of its reach into rural areas. And the interesting thing is what happened when decolonization happened, when colonial governments left the rest of Africa, not here in the 60s and mainly the 60s, that in fact there wasn't a lot of change to the broadcasters. The broadcasters were simply taken over by the post-colonial governments. And there's a West African media analyst who I think is very good. He's now at a university in South Africa who wrote about this, and I'm just going to show you his quote, and then I'll go back to the newspapers. He said that in most countries, journalists in the state media were little more than public relations men and women for the government or ruling party. Their role as mouthpieces or errand boys committed them much less to the truth and public service than to building a positive image, selling ideas, and promoting the interests of the state or ruling elite. In other words, that was what happened until the 90s, when things began to change in Africa and smaller community stations started coming on air, but that's another story. I wanted to go back and just compare radio listenership to newspapers. These are the latest figures that I could find on the top 10 selling newspapers. Look at that top one. 183,000. Now, I mean, even the smallest radio station practically is much more than that. There is a general decline in newspapers, we know, but in this country, which is marked by huge inequalities and an education system that is very unequal and very poor, many people don't rely on newspapers for their news. Most people rely on radio. That's the weekend titles, the same kind of thing. You know, the Sunday Times used to sell about 400 and something thousand copies. It's down to just to 283,000. And even the Zulu-speaking paper, which was doing quite well, Isolezwe Ngongqibelo, is actually doing pretty badly now, because you have two radio you have Ukhozi and a community station that is Zulu-speaking, based in Durban, and it just cleans up, you know, news listeners. This is just shows you what has happened with the bar graph over the years. This is only since 2014, I think, and it's done per quarter. But it's actually just, I mean, that graph of newspaper readership is just going down and down, and people are switching to online consumption. That's true, but generally in this country, even with Twitter, there may be 6 million people on Twitter, that if you don't use radio, if you don't have radio as a means of purveying the news, you're basically not talking to very many people. You're talking to a small group. So, just to dwell on this of what Francis Nyamjo says, it didn't happen in South Africa. John has explained a lot of the reasons for that. But what was different in South Africa, that when 1990 came and the CODESA negotiations started a couple of years later, the nature of the anti-apartheid struggle determined a lot of what would happen with the public broadcaster. And because there had been, among others, civil rights group, a big anti-censorship coalition that became part of a group called the Coalition on Independent Broadcasting. They pushed for a broadcaster that was independent and free and fair. De Klerk had set up his own task team on the broadcaster that was then basically rejected by this group, and they insisted that there should be an independent task team to look at how to transform the broadcaster, what had been a state broadcaster, an apartheid state broadcaster, into a public broadcaster. It helped a lot that the ANC wasn't in power then, because the ANC was powerful and popular, but the ANC threw its weight behind this group. And so when it came to the push, they basically supported that there should be a law before even the first elections that guaranteed the independence of the broadcaster. And it was called the Public Broadcasting Act. And I also don't expect you to read these things. The Broadcasting Act of South Africa, it's been amended twice, but the main spirit of it hasn't changed. And the spirit is it's about making services available to all people. It's about 11 languages. Radio actually broadcasts in 13 languages. I'll refer to that just at the end. It's about protecting the cultural heritage of South Africa. And what I've put in bold there, it's to provide significant news and public affairs programming which meets the highest standards of journalism, as well as fair and unbiased coverage, impartiality, balance, and independence from government, commercial, and other interests. Now, this, as we know, has been sort of honoured more in the breach than in looking at it recently. But nevertheless, it's there in the Act. The complications in the Act, it also protects diversity and democracy. So freedom of expression and journalistic, creative and programming independence is specifically protected in the Broadcasting Act. The complication is why, I suppose the question we need to ask is, has the Act been so disregarded? Has it been so easy to disregard the Act? Not only now in the latest incarnation, but 10 years ago when I was the head of radio news was when certainly my first big fallout with the then people in charge. One of the reasons I think there's a document called the Articles of Association, which governs the relationship between the shareholder and the board. And the shareholder is the government, and the government is represented by the Minister of Communications, and that can be altered by the minister. And in fact, when I was on the board in 2012, I think it was 2012, the then minister, the late Roy Padiachi, altered those articles to say, it used to say that the board recommended the executive appointments of the CEO, the CFO, and the COO, and he changed it to say that the minister appoints. The minister always used to have to approve, but it was then changed to the minister appoints. That has since got even more. I think in the current age, we've heard stories of how the minister actually came into the interview, the board meeting, and specifically appointed or was instructed the board to appoint Hlaudi Motsoeneng. But there'd been signs of that before as COO, even notwithstanding the Public Protector's report. There certainly were precedents for what happened then. When I was on the board, we had interviews for a chief financial officer and sent, I think, the name of one or perhaps two candidates to the then Minister Dina Pule, who rejected both of them without reasons and asked us to interview another person. The excuse was her CV had fallen through the cracks. She was appointed against all of our better judgment by the minister. And it turned out that within 6 months, she'd given money without any authorization at all to the minister's boyfriend's company, who was running a big ICT conference in Cape Town. There were other transgressions as well, and she was suspended, and then that faction fell out. So I don't know what's actually happened in terms of how that's been followed up. But so the critical thing is not the Act. It seems to me that it's that relationship between the board and the minister. But there's a complication in the relationship as well, because Parliament is also inserted. So Parliament nominates the board. The President appoints. The President is the appointing authority. The shareholder is represented by the minister, but the board reports to Parliament, is accountable to Parliament. So it's a very complicated four-way relationship, and I think it might be, I'm not quite sure how to fix it, but I think that's part of the problem. But the oversight mechanisms are weakened, I think, because of that. So what has really happened in the weakening of these oversight roles of both Parliament and the board is that it's allowed a lacuna to develop where there has been, it's not just about political censorship, it's really about a lot of corruption. When I was at Cape Talk a few weeks ago, we had documents sent to us. It's not an entirely new story. The Sunday Times had word of it a few months ago, but these were much more detailed, about a tender for a new studio in Johannesburg, which cost a fortune, I think 43 million rand or something, and that in all the news coverage that there was about the 7 journalists who were suspended and then dismissed and then reinstated. I mean, they were extremely courageous. But there was hardly anything said about the finance and technical people who have just left the SABC because they objected to the studio. The studio, there was a tender that went out apparently for a studio revamp, a legal tender. The tender was suddenly without notice cancelled and a new contract was put in place. And when the technical and finance people demurred in paying it, they were effectively suspended, even though, and I discovered this after the fact, that Treasury had actually issued one of the smaller guys at Treasury who managers who do their job well had basically instructed that the amount not be paid because the tender was not legal. Well, that was just ignored, and it hasn't really been mentioned much in the media, although we did cover it on radio. So now, about the same time this was happening, it's a very interesting lesson in politics to me, and how you kind of do these things on the one hand and then appeal to the public gallery on the other. So at the very same time this was happening, Hlaudi Motsoeneng introduced the 90% local content rule, which showed that, so he was incredibly popular with local musicians. But it masked a whole lot of other things, and really there was no evidence to suggest that it was the right thing to do in terms of revenues. Which brings me on to, I just want to quickly talk about finances. People think the finances are really critical at the broadcaster, which is why the governance is so important. And I think everyone thinks that, I hear people moaning, yeah, we pay, it's our taxpayers' money, etc., that goes in. I think you all think that it's a publicly funded thing. Well, actually, it's not really. This is where the revenue of the SABC comes from. Most of it comes from advertising. The government grants are actually quite small, and they're for educational programs, they're for earmarked programs. License fees are about 11%. There's been a lot of controversy over the funding model. My own view, for what it's worth, is that when you've got a government that has so many priorities in developing a country, I think that if something can be self-sustaining, that it's important to possibly find a way to make it self-sustaining, and radio and TV can raise ads. Again, but to do that, it needs to be well governed. Advertisers need to have as much faith in it than anything. So that's been the one thing. In the midst of the money problems and the way that it's been used as a kind of a place for people to get rich, which is really the wrong place to be in my view, if you want to get rich, is not the public broadcaster, has been as well the political interference. John spoke about Zwelaki's role. I was political editor then. I've been in the SABC in 3 incarnations, but I was political editor then from end of 94 to about 97, and also worked under him. And I must say that when I look back, I can't believe how good it was compared to what it became. But the history of censorship really began, I think, after 1999. My first experience of it was in 2003, 4, around about the time of those elections and the Zimbabwean elections, when the then head of news banned commentators from certain commentators on commenting on the Zimbabwean elections, including the then brother of the then president, Moletsi Mbeki, as my then teenage son said, but dumb, to ban the president's brother, but nonetheless he felt that he could, because he didn't like what he said about Zimbabwe. And that became known as the blacklisting saga. There was worse to come. I'd left after that. And then the recent scandal about the edicts to say that you can't cover protests that target government property. The journalists who complained about that, all of them just fired without, at least when Snooky Zikalala was there, when I was there, I wrote him a letter and he actually responded to the letter. I left in any event shortly after that, but he didn't try and fire me. He might have if I'd stayed a few months, but in this case, they actually just fired the guys straight out. So the extent of unaccountable power has got much worse there, I think. And certainly that started when our board was there with Hlaudi Motsoeneng, who was then not even COO, he was, I think, not acting COO, walked into Radio Metro, where there was a program to discuss the coverage of the upcoming ANC's Mangaung conference, and ordered a whole lot of journalists who were about to go on air out on the grounds that there wasn't an ANC representative there, which was bizarre reasoning, apart from the fact that even if he'd thought that, he should never have done it. And then one more that I became aware of in those last days of ours on the board, which was when he withdrew in a program that I think was called Agenda. Anyway, it was a TV program, and Jonathan Shapiro, the cartoonist, aka Zapiro, was about to appear on it, and he pulled the whole thing. It was like during December, so I was on leave when we got back to work and we had the first board meeting. We had a flaming stand-up row, not only myself, other board members as well with him. And his reply to me was quite classic. I think then he said, "But Prof, have you seen his cartoons?" This was about Jonathan. So it's not really the point. I don't care if you like them or not. You don't do that. But anyway, for what it's worth, the power was such that our board voted to remove him from that position. Within 3 weeks, we were dissolved. And that was the Latuli House connection, I think, that John wrote about. We were gone, everybody, including even the ANC people. So I'm going to wrap up now. I began with a story about how important radio was. And I want to just tell you a little story about this station, to show what good radio can do. I'm sure none of you have heard of this. It's in the Northern Cape in a place called Platfontein. It has 6,000 listeners, and it has a radius of about 15 kilometers, 30 kilometers from where it is. The audience of these are two groups of people called the Ku and the Kwe, who came from southern Angola and northern Namibia. They were San people who were used as trackers during the war for Namibian independence by the South African Defence Force. And when Namibia got independence, the South African army said to them, "You know what, SWAPO is going to kill you," which was probably completely untrue. But nevertheless, they put people who'd never seen a car before practically into a big cargo plane and flew them to the middle of the Northern Cape and put them in a tent town in a place called Schmitsdrift, which is about 100 kilometers west of Kimberley. They lived in tents and shacks for about 8 or 9 years with, an absolutely devastated community, alcoholism, no education, poverty, etc. And then somehow, I think because of the provincial government there, under Mani de Picho, who was the then premier, said to the SABC, "You can't, these people are not covered at all in terms of languages, etc. And can't you do something?" So then the Afrikaans station, RSG, started a station there, which is called XKFM, particularly for Ku and Kwe people. And it ran for about 3 years, and then our news people, and I was there then, our regional news editor went and scoured these dusty streets. When I say streets, they're not really, it was a big camping site. He found about 4 people with matric. And he interviewed them. There was a general knowledge quiz. One of the questions, I think they were quite prescient, was who was Jacob Zuma. He was then deputy president, and the one they both chose was the recently deposed mayor of Kimberley. But anyway, maybe they knew something we don't. So he chose 2, one in each language, and they became news reporters and began to run a current affairs show. And it's quite a remarkable thing to see, because the languages have no cognates. The only linking language is Afrikaans. So the bulletins used to come from Joburg, now they do their own in Afrikaans and were translated directly on air. But what the station has managed to do is that after being in Platfontein, they began to lobby through the radio for a removal, at least in Schmitsdrift, to a removal nearer Kimberley, to a site nearer Kimberley, where they now are in Platfontein. I think that it was really the public pressure exerted by this radio station that moved the provincial government to do that. There's a clinic. There are many more people. The matric pass rate has gone up because the radio station has a few educational programs, and there are more people employed. It's certainly in the tourism industry and tracking and so on. And the radio station has expanded quite considerably, also because they do some of their programming in Afrikaans. So Kimberley people also listen to it. Now, there's no way that a commercial company would have done this. I mean, the costs are too high. The profit margin is way too low, and it's really a marginal community and thing. It's exactly and precisely the kind of thing that a public broadcaster should do. And this is why, for me, the public broadcaster is something that is so valuable and so worth saving and so worth basically engaging with in a way that makes it accountable to the community again. Thanks very much. I'm sorry I probably went over time. Yeah, I think that.
So, if there are any questions or comments,
I was perhaps confused by the brochure which referred to broadcasting and I didn't realise it was confined to radio broadcasting. That didn't make it any less interesting.
oh, okay, right. Our brochure entry refers to broadcasting, and the expectation was going to be it was about TV rather than radio.
Yeah.
Do you
Do you want the mic? Shall we? Do people want to use them? Can we? We can hear.
We can hear each other.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. You first, and then you.
You haven't really discussed the ANC's agenda in terms of propaganda. It's control of the radio and TV. Through ICASA, there was a hint of it, they control the private radio stations through licensing, and if they don't particularly like a private radio station because of its news or whatever, I have a former colleague who was off radio because he was anti-ANC in a small little comment the very morning that he made, who now lives overseas. And so they control it with licensing. It is a propaganda unit. I think Hlaudi was appointed, is my theory, that he is a Zuma appointee, that part of the deal is in fact to, he can take 10% and the remaining 90% gets kicked back, and you can guess to whom. I'd like your comments on some of those things, please.
Do you want to take
A few more. Okay.
Couple
so
of
your
questions.
question? Are you making notes?
I just wondered, why did the ANC cut the ground from underneath Hlaudi Motsoeneng over this firing of the not the firing of the journalists, but over the airing or the non-airing of the violent demonstrations, saying no, we didn't ask him to do it, and they seemed to cut the ground away from underneath him. After which, of course, he was deposed. But the whole ball started to roll from that action.
So
And
the timing of the turning away from.
Well, why did they do it? Why did the ANC feel they had to disengage themselves from this decision?
Okay. And do you want to take another two?
We can take, let's take another one.
Take another one?
Yeah, and then we can do another three.
Ladies at last, yes. You, yes.
This is not strictly related to broadcasting, but why haven't people fired by the SABC gone to the CCMA?
John, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. We're going to run out of time soon, so I'm going to go through a few things quickly. The only thing I'll say about TV is TV was first shown in South Africa in this university and at Wits in the 20s. And there was an article in the a headline in the Rand Daily Mail that said, TV coming next year. Of course, it was delayed worldwide by the Depression and then the war, but we took till 76, so we were way behind even Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia as it was then. But I did want to just take up the issue of Hlaudi and Jacob Zuma and what the agenda is. And I want to bring in something I'd meant to mention, which is this whole set-top box battle, because it's extremely significant. This is the battle which has been alluded to on the ad hoc committee about the deal between SABC and MultiChoice. MultiChoice is the company that produces your DSTV satellite broadcasting, and it's owned by Naspers. What happened, and I have a reference to it in here in the book, that the chairman, recently resigned chairman, said that our relationship with MultiChoice, it's not a friendship, it's not a partnership. I want it to be a marriage, and SABC will be the bridegroom and MultiChoice will be the bride. What that's really about, if one can disengage one's mind from that image, is that SABC did a deal with MultiChoice Naspers, who, by the way, are way ahead of everybody on all of these things. Naspers are long-term thinkers. They've built themselves into the 5th biggest media company in the world. Naspers realized that they needed to control things, as they always do, for long-term market share. And the deal they did was to buy from the SABC the control of their archive. So SABC can still use it, but it means competitors can't, and Naspers can on DSTV. And in the fine print, which I've read, it says that SABC must accept Naspers' version of how we go on to digitization. Now, the impact of that is to destroy all competitors of Naspers. But now, let me just say a little bit about this, because this puts the two sides in great focus. When I was in government in the 90s, in the regulator in the 90s, we already knew there had to be digital migration. When you move our broadcasters from analog to digital, you free up masses of spectrum for cheap, fast internet. The whole information economy should have taken off. And that's why I have a chapter in my book called Why South Africa Missed the Information Revolution. We should have gained it. It would have created thousands of good paying jobs for black South Africans, above ground, nice jobs. The whole thing was messed up. Now, at that time, we already knew we had deadlines for digital migration. It had to be done correctly. So that's all been delayed at the expense of the public and the economy and jobs because of this. It sounds counterintuitive. If you make the set-top box unencrypted, no competitor is going to survive, because they can't buy programming from Hollywood or anyone else, because you've got to be able to know who your market is. If you make it encrypted, that's what all the public people want and the competitors want. Then you can control it, and other competitors can come in, and also you can find ways to get it to the ordinary public. Naspers' deal said, we'll give you 500 million over 5 years, you give us your archive, and you give us total control of the method of digital migration and who gets onto the airwaves. Now, who's on whose side? This is about money, very much about money. I mean, I think propaganda is part of it, but Hlaudi is a good friend of the president. He's very close with the president, and the deals are over who gets to build the set-top box, but that's only part of the money. But the more important thing is Naspers gets control of broadcasting in Southern Africa for the long-term future. Now, who's on whose side? The ANC has taken the right side. The cabinet has taken the right side. And they've both been ignored by successive ministers. And obviously, and it can only be because they're being told by the president, ignore the cabinet, ignore the ANC, and just do what I want. And all the signs are that that this is about corrupt money deals. I don't know what else to say about, and ETV was on the side of the competitors, obviously, and so this has put them in such a vulnerable position that ETV is now trying to sell. now, I wanted to say one more thing. You know, I was talking to Jonathan Janssen on my television show, and he made the point, African universities, and this is relevant to the SABC, all declined when there were three things going on: underfunding by government, political interference, and chronic instability. You see all three in the SABC. And I don't think, obviously nobody sits down and says, I'm going to do those three things to destroy the SABC. They're consequences of short-term decisions for political propaganda or commercial reasons. And just one specific example of that. When I was in the Broadcasting Authority, I oversaw the triple inquiry where we set up a plan for the future funding of the SABC. And we privatized 6 stations. And we got 519 million rand for it, which was still quite a lot of money in those days. And the agreement, and Parliament had approved our report, which said that money goes to the SABC to compensate for losing these very lucrative commercial broadcasters. I'm very proud of that deal, by the way. I'm not